PCC is divided into. But the first one they tackled was the Barents Sea, the extreme northern part of Norway. 4 major economic activities: fishing, which is increasingly less important; oil and gas, which is tremendously important to the national economy; marine shipping, which is increasingly important because of all of the shipping activity that will take place bringing Arctic oil and Russian oil through the Norwegian seas; and nature conservation. Those were the 4 major sectors that they included in their planning process. Nature conservation is also very important to Norway. They developed a plan, an integrated management plan for those 4 sectors, fisheries included, that basically integrated the separate regulatory regimes for those sectors into one plan. And they said, this is what we're going to do. And it included also moving marine navigation routes further offshore to avoid the high-value biological and ecological areas alongshore. It included seasonally regulating the oil and gas operations so that when the sea ice was fairly south, a lot of these activities were not permitted, and as sea ice retreated, they could move in and do oil and gas exploration and development, and et cetera. They really integrated, as I said, each of these 4 sectors into a single plan. Legislative authority. Authority of any kind to undertake spatial planning is incredibly important. If you don't have authority, chances are you will never implement your plan, and in fact, the plan may never get off the ground because of challenges to the authority that exists. Legislative authority can take many different sizes and shapes. It can be national legislation. That's good. Legislation stays around when people change, when administrations come and go, and that represents probably the best kind of approach. There are other ways to do it. You can do it through existing legislation, whether it's environmental legislation, biodiversity legislation, economic development legislation. You can usually find something to hang the authority hook to hang authority on. In the case of the United Kingdom, they decided 6 years ago they would actually develop national legislation for marine spatial planning. One problem with this: it takes a long time to pass legislation, and it may not wind up looking like what you thought it should be in the beginning. But England, in fact, managed to, or the UK managed to pass legislation that took them 5 or 6 years to do it. But now they have a very strong authority for carrying out marine spatial planning. And in fact, they've just started spatial planning. They have 9 regions identified. They are taking 2 of those regions to begin with. It's going to take them 4 or 5 years to develop an individual plan for each of those regions. And by 2020, they hope to be finished with complete coverage of UK waters. I have Germany up here not because it's a very exciting marine spatial plan, but it's another kind of the use of authority that could be used in other places. Germany is a place that also has a very strong history of planning on land. And about 15 years ago, that planning legislation was extended to the territorial sea, out to 15 miles, 15 nautical miles, and it was given to the states, the Länder of Germany, the responsibility to plan for that area. 6 or 7 years ago, it was extended out to the edge of the exclusive economic zone, and the benefit of that is they have a seamless authority from the interior of the country to the edge of the exclusive economic zone to implement sea use, or land use on the land side, obviously, but sea use legislation all the way to their 200-mile nautical limit, using the same criteria, the same procedures, etc. We want to do ecosystem-based management. A good example of that, again, I think, is Australia. Australia, outside the Great Barrier Reef. They also do good ecosystem-based management inside the Great Barrier Reef, but in this case, there are other regions, and they're on this next diagram, where they've identified 5 big planning regions. They call them bioregions. And for each of those bioregions, they have developed a database and a report called a bioregional profile that becomes the basis for doing spatial planning. The bioregional profile identifies ecologically and biologically important areas, again, as the basis for planning. Almost done. Another important characteristic is financing, because often we want to do certain things, but we don't have the money to get it started. And in fact, this is increasingly the problem where governments, the general revenues of governments are decreasing rather than increasing. It's expensive to do spatial planning. And how do we actually get it financed? Well, 80 or 90% of the world relies on these kinds of revenues, but there are a few places where there's an innovative scheme. One of them is the People's Republic of China, which has a requirement in national legislation to do something called territorial sea zoning. Don't particularly like that term, but that's what they call it. It's spatial planning in the territorial sea. But the interesting thing is that the government in its national legislation has said this is a public resource. This doesn't belong to industry. It doesn't belong to the fishing fleet. It doesn't belong to the oil and gas industry. It's not the dredgers that own this. It's a public resource. And if people are using this public resource, they should pay to use it. And they should pay commensurate to the value of the resource that they're extracting. That's a profound idea. I mean, that's what we're talking about in academic circles, but China has actually implemented that. And it's a state-owned asset. If you're going to use it, you're going to pay for it. 70% of the fees that are collected are returned to provincial governments. They've bumped the responsibility for planning down to provincial governments. And they carry out management activities based on the revenues that are generated through these user charges. They've collected $4 billion through 2010. The slide is a little bit outdated. I'm going to conclude in two other areas, so almost done. Bottom-up marine spatial planning. Everybody thinks that marine spatial planning is only top-down, and it starts out at the national level and then sort of dribbles down to subnational or local governments. It can start from the bottom up. And in one case, the Pacific coast of Canada, it's being driven not by the government, but by indigenous Indian tribes who have the rights to co-manage resources in the offshore areas of Canada. There are 11 indigenous communities. They have substantial resources because they've been given these rights and have collected a lot of monies from forest management in particular, and they're now extending that out into the marine environment. They've started marine spatial planning. They've in fact developed spatial plans at the local level that they're now aggregating up to community and the whole provincial and offshore areas. And it's a great example of how planning can actually, led by communities, can drive a federal process. I'll finish with the United States because I think you've heard a presentation a month or so ago, or some of you at least have heard a presentation on what's going on in the United States. My take on what's going on in the United States is not much. A lot of talk, a lot of planning, not a whole lot of action so far. It's been a developing country with respect to its marine environment, and that's been a problem for its history, basically. But in fact, the president did sign an executive order that said we will have a national ocean policy, and one part of that policy is going to be marine spatial planning. The United States has the largest EEZ in the world. It's been divided into 9 planning regions. A lot of organization has already taken place over the last year because of that executive order. It's about to start a planning process. Has had plans to spend about $24 million on getting started. That's not going to happen. There will be a lot less money available for spatial planning in the United States. And some of these areas, in fact, might start a planning process, certainly in New England and a few other places. And the reason that New England is going to be one of the beginning places is that they've already developed plans at the state level. I mentioned the Massachusetts plan. There's another plan for Rhode Island. And because of time, I won't go into any detail on that. I can respond to questions. So let's just look quickly at a number of keys that I would call must be present in order to have success. Authority, critically important. A subset idea of authority is that you have to have accountable agencies. Okay? People have, John said this, and I'll repeat it. If you're going to have authority vested in government agencies, those agencies have to be accountable to actually carry out the authority that's been provided to them. You have to have sustained financing in order if this is going to be successful. Stakeholder engagement, critically important. Stakeholders vary from place to place. What works in stakeholder participation here may be very different from what happens in China, where they have no Chinese word to translate stakeholder. You need clear, measurable objectives, use of best available scientific information, a focus on the future, performance monitoring and evaluation, critically important, and again, that's why measurable objectives are important. You want to know where you're going and if you're getting there. And finally, you have to be willing to adapt. The most important thing is get started, learn by doing, and all these other things are going to fall in place, and you'll learn how to do this very quickly. You'll know what you need to know in terms of information, and are likely to have a successful spatial planning process. This is a website that UNESCO has developed that says a lot of the same things that I did. It's a good basis, a good reference for material on marine spatial planning. And with that, I'll stop. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Bob. Preguntas?